Hi everyone, we're going to look at projected winners in the energy landscape, both politically and economically, and these are projections based on what's been happening in recent history. And this could change. It could change on a dime due to a pandemic, a change in population, a natural catastrophe, war, as well as finding new technologies or new ways of doing things that we just haven't discovered quite yet. So bear that in mind, but right now the projected winner is China, and that may be surprising, and maybe it won't be. One thing about China is that we know we can get so much from China, and we can get it really cheap, and that in the past is, applies to everything from shirts to phones to binoculars to doesn't even matter what. And now it's really applying to renewable technologies, including solar panel production and lithium-ion battery production. And why is that important? They're willing to make a lot of those things really cheaply and at high ecological cost, whereas a lot of countries are not. So unless another country comes up with a way of doing the same work at a comparable rate with less economic damage, China's probably going to lead the way in those sectors. One alternative that could happen is if we were to come up with easier ways of recycling some of this stuff, so we wouldn't have to constantly buy new solar panels, new lithium-ion batteries, or new other technologies that China may produce for us that we'll find meets our energy needs. So that's one thing. China also has developed its economy very quickly. And in order to give energy to itself, if it were to rely on fossil fuels, it would have to import a lot of fossil fuel. Right now, it imports about 75% of the fossil fuel it uses simply because it can't develop enough. And China, or any smart country, would say that's not a good thing, because if I'm relying on other countries to give me my fuel supply or my water supply or my food, if for whatever reason that channel is cut, either because of diplomacy or because there was a catastrophe, then I'm SOL. So what China's done is it said, I'm going to become more energy independent. I'm going to secure my own energy. And so they've invested a lot in renewables, which is great, and some other things. They're still developing about one coal-fired power plant every week or two. But the idea is that they've really diversified their energy portfolio. So they're a lot stronger already, and they're willing to supply the world with what it will want and need to do the same thing. So that's one of the reasons that China is a projected winner. Another reason is that they're willing to protect what they have and even lay claims to things that they don't necessarily have to gain more power in that way. So one is looking at the South China Sea, and that's an area of contention that we'll talk about. And the other is strengthening ties with what we would call dangerous states. So that includes Russia, Iran, North Korea. These countries are often topics of, great movies that were spy movies and interesting things, but they really are threats to a lot of people in the Western world, even people that live in their own countries. Okay, so just a really brief thing. Over time, and this is 2016, and I assure you that Asia's fraction has only grown, electricity production from renewables is obviously dominated by Asia. And if we were to break that down, we would see that China is the clear lead in that area. So if China is this much of Asia's production, and Asia is much more than everyone else, China is really the leader when it comes to producing electricity from renewables and manufacturing those technologies that allow them to do so and selling those technologies elsewhere. So here's just a quick image. This is a solar fab plant in China where they've actually gone through the whole process, and they're now at the end stage of creating solar modules. But there's a lot of steps when it comes to making solar cells, and a lot of it has to be very clean room. You don't want to you don't want to get debris on any of this stuff or even breathe on it as it's being developed. So it's not a straightforward process, and it does require a lot of investment. But China dominates not only sort of the latter steps, but all the steps to developing solar panels. So this is really just showing that, it's not just the end product, it's like all the stages. They can do it from start to finish, not only with solar panels and solar cells and solar modules, but also with lithium-ion batteries. And why is this such an interesting thing? Because almost everything we use that's smart has a lithium-ion battery. Your laptop, smartphones, if you were to drive an electric vehicle, all of these things. And we hope that that sort of electrification continues, because electricity is a very, very, very efficient way of carrying energy from one place to another. Let's go from 20 to 30% efficiency with combusting fossil fuels to 95, 98% efficiency when we use electricity. It's the clear direction we want to go. Okay, with lithium-ion batteries, why is that important? Well, it helps us store that energy for later use, and we can recharge it, and that's another important thing. Okay, lithium is element number 3. So element number 1 is hydrogen, 2 is helium, 3 is lithium. That said, lithium was kind of hard to produce cosmically, and you can take my astronomy class to learn all about that. But lithium is dispersed in a lot of soils in different areas in the world. And so some people say you can get lithium from any place. You just gather enough sand and soil and that crust. But then there are other places that have more abundant lithium. For example, Afghanistan has a lot of lithium, from my understanding. But this is a lithium mine, and so if it comes from the soil, that means you have to process a lot of soil, and that does not look like something that we really want to do while trying to maintain forests and maintain a lot of our natural landscapes. So interestingly, China is willing to do that and gather a lot of lithium and take it not only from the mining stage, but all the way through the sort of refining stage, if you will, to creating the cathode and the anode, that's the positive and negative terminals of a battery, to creating the battery itself, and then to packaging it and either putting it in something that we use later, like a phone, or packaging it and sending it to another manufacturing plant elsewhere so that they can process it and put it in whatever it is that they're making. So that they're willing to go to this sacrifice for that particular gain in the power and economic market is interesting. So if that continues, then they definitely would have some advantages. This could change, however, if we find a different kind of battery. And so I know when I was at MIT in my graduate studies, there were tons of people working on batteries. Yetming Cheng is one of them, and he's constantly working in batteries. He's had a couple of battery companies since, but he has this great video where he talks about, maybe we'll replace some of these components and make them from something else that's more economically feasible and less destructive. So that is an effort right now. Also, another way that we can get around this is if we were to figure out a good way of recycling lithium ion batteries, so we don't have to buy them continually. We can just take what we have and reuse them somehow. All right, so those are a couple of places. China's the projected winner because of renewable and battery supplies. And then also, I put concerns, because this makes me concerned, but it's really a security play by China. They also lay claims to this area of the world. So you'll see a globe, and you see this like really tiny place. And if you zoom in on that, you see this other thing. It's a body of water between a lot of Asian countries, where you see China and Taiwan and Vietnam and the Philippines. And so China lays claim to this area, and it's based on really old maps. And since then, the UN has stepped in, and The Hague, where you have the sort of seat of international justice, has stepped in, and they've said, that violates international law. China, this really is not your area. So why is this such an important thing in contentious region? It's because about a third of global trade flows through this area. So if someone actually controls the area, they control trade, and that gives them a lot of leverage in terms of dealing with other policies, dealing with whatever it is that they want to. So this is something that's ongoing, and even recently, I think this is from 2021, even recently, China did an intimidating thing where they put hundreds of boats in the area that the Philippines claims is theirs, and the Philippines says they're military boats, and please get out of here, and China said, oh no, they're just fishing boats, don't worry. But there's a lot of this sort of intimidation that's happening. And why is this such a hot spot? So why don't they just go somewhere else? Well, one, these are important areas, but this is a hotspot because there are a lot of Chinese military bases and United States military bases. So in some ways, it's a really dangerous area, because if the tensions become too high and someone does something silly or not thinking, then that could set off a world war, which would not be very good. So that's a big concern for this area. Another thing that's a bit concerning is the alliances that we see happening between Iran, China, North Korea, and Russia. So by the way, if you were to Google bromance between Xi Jinping and Putin, you would see them making pancakes together, drinking together, laughing together. They're forming this really strong bond, I guess this way to you. And why is that interesting? Well, or why would they even do that? Well, Russia and China are like, they're neighbors. They're right next to each other, and they control a lot of the land in Asia. And interestingly, Russia has a lot of natural gas and oil. And you've read about the tensions that's caused between Russia and the Ukraine, Russia and Europe. But Russia now recently has this huge pipeline that's piping natural gas to China. And so China sees this as, okay, another energy source, but also Russia spends a lot on its military, and so does China. And Russia and China see the Western world as threats to things that they want to do. So not only do China and Russia feel that way, but also Iran and North Korea feel that way. So this alliance really gives a lot of power to that group that says, the Western world is really impeding the things that we want to do. And that's probably their point of view. Our point of view is, oh no, this is dangerous. Russia interferes with elections. gives us cybersecurity attacks. China is, basically backwards engineers things we have, has terrible human rights track record. And Iran is developing nuclear weapons. They're now developing within the past few months, they said they're going to develop uranium to 60% enrichment. North Korea is also always trying to develop nuclear weapons. So this is not a good thing. But, as a power play, it would exert a lot of power. So we don't want to make relations between this group so bad that it does incite some sort of war. So this is a concern that is important to bring up, and it's a way for China to sort of protect what it has. All right, so all part of global politics. Now, interestingly, in recent years, the Russian and Chinese military have had massive military drills, biggest exercises since the 1980s. And so here, this is 2015 on the left side, and so you see Russia and China. And then on the right side, you see another example from 2020. They're not wearing masks, but you see them sort of exercising in this way. And apparently, Iran was invited to this as well. So that's just, I don't know if they're getting ready or they're just trying to show that they have power, but it is a little concerning. And when we look at how much money is spent on military, luckily for us, the US spends quite a bit. But if we look at how much China is spending and how much Russia spends, and we were to somehow be able to guess how much the North Korea and Iran would be willing to put in, then it starts to add up, particularly when we think about, okay, China is becoming a peer rival of the United States. So that number for China is just going to grow. So the reason I'm bringing this up is because energy is a big deal. Who controls energy is a big deal. And people will go to war over things like energy. For example, what we've done in the Middle East in the past, quite a bit. Okay, so just something to be aware of. All right, so China is the clear winner right now if trends continue the way they are. But what about the United States? The United States might be second place. It could be first, maybe, but we're not as well organized as China. With China, a decision is made and everything changes. With us, it takes a lot of debate, which is a good thing, much healthier, but it also can slow us down in some ways. So one thing that we do have, remember power is about having a lot, is we now have lots of access to oil. So those countries who need oil for a longer period of time could rely on us. So that's something that gives us a little bit of power. Also, and this is a wonderful thing that the U.S. has done forever and hopefully will continue to do, is that we let many ideas bloom. And the ones that went out economically, or went out because they're just obviously the better decision. So not a lot of places will put venture capital into new ideas to see what happens. But we do. We do that not only in terms of startups and entrepreneurship and that kind of thing, but also in terms of government investments. So the government puts a lot of money into national lab research, as well as university research. They're putting in less over time, so I think one of his initiatives is to increase that, because with that kind of investment, we get things like solar cells, we get things like the internet, we get things like, unfortunately, nuclear technology. We get things that we take advantage, that we forget. You know what I'm saying? All right, so that's the main thing one of the main things that we have going for us is we let lots of people think together and come up with even more innovation. And another way we might have some more power is we might increase our renewable use pretty quickly. So that's in italics because it's on the political stage right now, and we're seeing how this will play out. In terms of security, we have a historically strong military, so we're very good at defending our interests in ways that a lot of people don't agree with, and probably you and I included. But one of the things that's working against us right now is that we've really hurt some foreign ties that we've had and exacerbated some challenges with other countries that we didn't mean to, or we certainly don't want to. So we're in this sort of bizarre place where it really depends on what decisions we make over the next few years. All right. This is just a reminder that the U.S. is producing lots of oil, and right now on stage are potential deep investments in infrastructure and renewables. So hopefully these will go through, and that will increase not only our power, but our security. And so maybe we will be second place, if not better. When we look at the Middle East, historically, really big, powerful power player in terms of energy. It still has lots of oil supply, so it has lots of supply that other countries still using a lot could gather from, so it could have power in that way, in oil and natural gas, but it's really volatile. It tends to be a really unstable region. Just recently, as you might have seen from a previous video, there was an attack from Iran on a Saudi Arabian oil field. So I grew up with lots of attacks happening in Iraq and Iran, and it seems to be ongoing. So we'll see what happens in the future there, but that's something that sort of is a strike against the Middle East. The United Arab Emirates, and I'll show you where this is, it's a tiny little country on the Arabian Peninsula. It's actually doing quite well in terms of renewables, and I'll talk about that a little more in a moment. Security. So it always will have strong ties with those who depend on its oil and natural gas, but now the US and China will depend less on its oil and natural gas, making the region less defended than it was before, meaning that places like the UAE, who is trying to develop renewables, might try to make other relationships stronger. So, for example, with Israel, because Israel has a really strong military compared to the UAE. So if they form a bond, now at least there's some protection for that part of the Middle East. Another thing going against security are those inner conflicts and tensions that occur in the Middle East. So here's just a quick picture of the Middle East area. So what you see is, the main thing that you see is the Arabian Peninsula that's sticking off there. Also, Turkey is kind of in this weird place where it's sort of European and sort of in the Middle East. I spent a lot of time there. And then Iran is the big nuclear threat in the region. Syria is obviously having tons of civil issues. If you have watched the news in the past 10 years, anything that's dealt with Syria has never been good. And then you have sort of like these oases, like Jordan is actually a pretty great place. Seems like it's very progressive. Saudi Arabia in some sense, in some ways. And then the United Arab Emirates, they're really investing heavily in renewable energy. You might think, why are they doing that? They have lots of oil supply, but it's really cheap. It's conventional, meaning it's really easy to grab out of the ground and process and ship elsewhere. But they realize that it's not the energy of the future. So they have a lot of easy money from the fossil fuels they do produce right now, and they're spending a lot thinking about the future. So they actually have this huge renewable initiative. And if you remember the solar farm that I showed you last week in the desert, that was put on by the UAE, the United Arab Emirates. And so I would say they're one of the sane groups, stable groups. Apparently, it's the second safest country in the world. And they're trying to really show their presence in renewable conferences and like develop ties, more visits from the US. And they're trying to develop their ties with Israel for greater protection, because now the US and China are not protecting these oil fields anymore because we don't need them, which is kind of scary. All right, so the Middle East has some things going for it, and some things are a bit challenging. But I think the UAE will be a clear winner. So that's the UAE in orange, and that's Israel, who they're trying to tie ties with, in green. All right, so what about some other nation states and countries? Well, there are other areas in the world that have immense but volatile supplies for oil, natural gas, and minerals. So oil and natural gas, there are areas in Africa and Latin America and South America that have been invested in by other countries and exploited for their oil, which means they haven't really gotten the profits from them. And if they have gotten profits, it's generally through corruption. So a lot of the society in those areas is impoverished because they haven't gotten the benefits that other countries sort of bought and took away. And because there is some degree of I want what you don't have, there's a high degree of the corruption in that area. All right, so that's the power, but it's not very secure. Also, in a lot of these areas, they're disproportionately affected by climate change. So we think about places in Africa in particular who will feel the effects of climate change more than others. So this is just to show a couple of countries of interest. Venezuela produces a lot of oil. And then you have some other places, Nigeria being number one, Algeria, Angola, Libya was in the news several years ago from an attack on its leader that we led, and all kinds of things. So it's really not the most stable, but in particular, Venezuela, Nigeria, Algeria, Angola, and I would add Iran, are going to not keep pace really with the changes in energy infrastructure and switches to more stable energy sources and cleaner energy sources as the rest of the world, due to poverty and corruption. Okay. So that's in summary: China, potential winner in renewable supplies, strong economy, strategic alliances with those who don't play by the rules and are developing nuclear technologies at a frightening pace. US, a potential second place, and it depends on the decisions we make in terms of our renewable investments, as well as how many foreign ties we can actually re-strengthen. The Middle East is not looking good because a lot of people are not as interested in the oil supplies there, and it's a bit unstable. But the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, may have the best outcomes. They're really thinking about the future. Others, challenges to future gains without interventions will happen. Okay, that's the third video, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the very last one.